The quiet halls of Golden Meadows Nursing Home had been Alice Wilson's home for the past 3 years. At 82, she never imagined she'd find herself in such a place, but life had other plans after her beloved husband Tom passed away. Their cozy little house, filled with memories of 54 years together, became too much for her to manage alone. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains of room 237 as Alice sat in her favorite chair, the one Tom had insisted on bringing from their old home. Her weathered hands smoothed over the familiar fabric, tracing patterns she'd memorized over decades. A collection of family photos lined her small windowsill, snapshots of happier times when their children were young, before they scattered across the country chasing their dreams. Just like birds leaving the nest, she often thought to herself with a mixture of pride and loneliness. Her daughter Jenny lived in Seattle with her own family, while her son David had settled in Florida. They called regularly and visited when they could, but the distance made frequent visits impossible. Life at Golden Meadows hadn't always been this challenging. When Alice first arrived, the staff seemed attentive, and the facility sparkled with promise. But over the past year, things had changed dramatically. New management took over, bringing with them cost-cutting measures that slowly chipped away at the quality of care. It started with small things: delayed responses to call buttons, meals served lukewarm, and medications sometimes arriving hours late. Alice, who had worked as a school teacher for 35 years, noticed the growing exhaustion in the nurses' faces as they struggled to keep up with too many patients and too little support. One particular morning stood out in her mind. She had woken up feeling dizzy, her arthritis flaring up worse than usual. Pressing the call button, she waited patiently for help. 5 minutes passed, then 15, then 45. Her water pitcher sat empty on the bedside table, just out of reach. The morning medication that usually helped ease her joint pain remained untouched in the medical cart down the hall. When a young nurse's aide finally rushed in, apologizing profusely, Alice could see tears of frustration in the girl's eyes. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Wilson. We're short-staffed again, and I'm trying my best to cover 2 floors." The aide's hands trembled as she helped Alice sit up and take her pills. That wasn't the only incident. Last week, Alice had nearly fallen twice trying to reach the bathroom without assistance. The first time, she caught herself on the doorframe, her heart pounding in her chest. The second time, she wasn't so lucky. She slipped, barely managing to grab the sink to break her fall. The bruise on her arm had turned a deep purple, hidden beneath her favorite cardigan sweater. Other residents faced similar struggles. Alice often heard Mrs. Chen next door calling for help, her voice growing increasingly desperate. Mr. Thompson across the hall had developed bed sores because staff couldn't turn him as frequently as they should. The proud veteran who never complained now winced in pain whenever anyone touched him. During afternoon tea times, which Alice still observed faithfully, some habits from her English mother never faded. She would listen to her fellow residents share their own stories of neglect. Mrs. O'Brien couldn't remember the last time someone had helped her wash her hair properly. Mr. Garcia's diabetic diet requirements were increasingly overlooked, leading to dangerous blood sugar fluctuations. Alice wasn't one to make waves. Her mother had always taught her to be patient and understanding. "Everyone is fighting their own battles," she would say. But as she watched her friends suffer and herself struggle, something began to stir in her heart. The same sense of responsibility that had driven her to speak up for her students during her teaching years started to whisper in her ear. She began keeping a small notebook, documenting incidents with dates and times. Her handwriting, though slightly shaky, remained as neat as when she used to gray papers. Each entry represented not just a failure in care, but a human being's dignity being slowly eroded. The breaking point came during breakfast one morning. Alice watched as Mr. Peterson, a usually jovial 90-year-old, broke down in tears because no one had helped him to the bathroom in time. The shame and helplessness in his eyes struck something deep within her soul. She knew then that staying quiet wasn't being kind, it was allowing suffering to continue. That evening, as Alice sat in her chair watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, she made a decision. Tomorrow, during the monthly resident meeting, she would speak up. Not just for herself, but for every resident who couldn't or wouldn't speak for themselves. Her hands trembled slightly as she reviewed her notebook, but her resolve remained firm. Tom would want me to do this, she whispered to his photo on the windowsill. Her husband had always encouraged her to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult. As darkness settled over Golden Meadows, Alice prepared herself for what would come next, unaware that her simple act of courage would set in motion events that would change not only her life, but the lives of countless others. The morning of the resident meeting dawned grey and drizzly, matching the nervous flutter in Alice's stomach. She'd been awake since 4 a.m., reviewing her notes one last time by the dim light of her bedside lamp. Her small notebook, now filled with careful observations and dates, felt heavy in her cardigan pocket. The meeting room at Golden Meadows was actually just the dining hall, with chairs rearranged in uneven rows. As residents slowly gathered, some wheeling themselves in while others were helped by staff members, Alice noticed how tired everyone looked. Mr. Peterson gave her a small wave from his wheelchair, the events from yesterday still visible in his slumped shoulders. Mrs. Chen sat nearby, absently rubbing her wrist where a nasty bruise had formed after a rush transfer from bed to chair. The facility administrator, Mrs. Thompson, stood at the front of the room in her crisp blue suit, clipboard in hand. Her heels clicked against the linoleum floor as she began going through the usual announcements. Upcoming activities, menu changes, the new painting class starting next month. Her voice carried the practiced cheerfulness of someone reading from a script. And now, does anyone have any concerns they'd like to address? Mrs. Thompson asked, her pen poised over her clipboard, clearly expecting the usual silence that followed this question at every monthly meeting. Alice's heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. Her fingers trembled as they gripped her notebook, but she thought of Tom, of his unwavering support through their years together. She could almost hear his voice. "Stand up for what's right, old girl. You've never backed down before." Slowly, Alice raised her hand. The small movement sent ripples through the quiet room. A few heads turned, surprised to see the usually reserved Mrs. Wilson drawing attention to herself. "Yes, Mrs. Wilson?" Mrs. Thompson's smile remained fixed, but her eyes narrowed slightly. Alice stood carefully, her joints protesting the movement. The notebook opened to her most recent entry, though she hardly needed to read it. These incidents were etched in her memory. "I've been keeping track of some concerns," she began, her voice soft but clear, carrying the same tone she used during her teaching days to command attention. In the past month alone, there have been 23 instances where residents waited over an hour for basic assistance. The room grew perfectly still. Even the usual creaks of wheelchairs and walkers fell silent. Last Tuesday, Mr. Peterson waited 2 hours for help to the bathroom. Alice's voice grew stronger as she continued. Mrs. Chen's medication was delayed by 3 hours on Thursday, causing her severe pain. Mr. O'Brien hasn't had a proper shower in 2 weeks because there's never enough staff to help him. Mrs. Thompson's smile had completely disappeared now. "Mrs. Wilson, I'm sure there have been occasional delays, but—" "I have dates and times for every incident," Alice interrupted gently, turning a page in her notebook. 3 residents have fallen in the past week alone because they couldn't wait any longer for help. I myself have bruises from trying to manage alone. Other residents began to nod, some murmuring in agreement. Mrs. Chen raised her hand shakily. "It's true. I pressed my call button for 2 hours last night. Nobody came. The dam had broken. One by one, residents began sharing their own stories. Mr. Peterson described his humiliation from the previous day. Mrs. O'Brien spoke up about her unwashed hair and how she'd been wearing the same clothes for 3 days because no one had time to help her change. Mrs. Thompson's face had grown increasingly red. "These are serious accusations," she said sharply. "If you were unhappy with our care, you should have brought these concerns to me privately." "We have," Alice replied quietly, "many times. Nothing has changed." "Our staff works very hard." "They do," Alice agreed. "But there aren't enough of them. They're exhausted and overwhelmed. This isn't about blaming the staff. It's about the decisions being made at a higher level that affect our care." A young nurse standing at the back of the room wiped tears from her eyes, nodding slightly when Alice glanced her way. "I was a teacher for 35 years," Alice continued. "I know what it means to care for others, to be responsible for their well-being. We're not asking for luxury, we're asking for basic dignity. to be helped to the bathroom when we need it, to receive our medications on time, to be treated like human beings. The silence that followed her words was deafening. Some residents had tears in their eyes. Others sat straighter in their chairs, as if Alice's words had awakened something in them too. Mrs. Thompson's voice, when it came, was ice cold. "Thank you for your input, Mrs. Wilson. We'll take these concerns under advisement." Meeting adjourned. As residents began to disperse, Alice felt a mix of relief and apprehension. She'd done it, she'd spoken up. But the look in Mrs. Thompson's eyes told her this wasn't over. Later that afternoon, as Alice sat in her room looking at old photographs, she heard quick footsteps approaching her door. Her heart sank when she saw Mrs. Thompson enter, followed by 2 members of the administrative staff. The facility director held a thick envelope in her hands, and her expression made Alice's blood run cold. "Mrs. Wilson," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice clipped. "We need to discuss your continued residency at Golden Meadows." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room as Alice realized that standing up for what was right might cost her the only home she had left. The eviction notice felt impossibly heavy in Alice's hands. 30 days. That's all she had to find a new place to live. The paper trembled as she read through the carefully worded document, full of cold legal terms that tried to disguise the simple truth: she was being pushed out for speaking up. "It's not personal, Mrs. Wilson," Mrs. Thompson had said, standing in Alice's doorway with perfectly manicured nails and not a hair out of place. "We simply feel that our facility can no longer meet your expectations." The way she emphasized that last word made it sound like a crime. Now, sitting alone in her room as evening settled in, Alice tried to make sense of it all. Her small space, barely bigger than a college dorm room, had become home over the past 3 years. The familiar scuff marks on the walls, the way the afternoon sun hit her collection of family photos, even the slightly squeaky drawer in her dresser, all of it would soon be gone. The reality of her situation began to sink in as she opened her old laptop, the one her grandson had given her last Christmas. Her fingers moved slowly over the keyboard as she searched for other nursing homes in the area. Each click brought fresh disappointment. The affordable ones had waiting lists months long. The ones with immediate openings cost more than twice what she was currently paying. Alice's Social Security check and small teacher's pension had been enough to cover Golden Meadows, but just barely. Her savings, once healthy, had been drained by Tom's medical bills in his final years. They'd been comfortable, not wealthy, choosing to spend their money on experiences and helping their children through college rather than building a retirement nest egg. She clicked through another facility's website, her heart sinking at the listed prices. Starting at $5,000 per month, it proclaimed cheerfully, as if that were pocket change. Alice's entire monthly income was just over $2,100. A soft knock at her door interrupted her increasingly desperate search. It was Rose, one of the night nurses, sneaking in after her shift ended. "I heard what happened," Rose whispered, her eyes red from crying. "It's not right, Mrs. Wilson. What they're doing to you isn't right." Alice reached out and patted the young nurse's hand. "Life isn't always fair, dear. We just have to keep going." "But where will you go?" Rose asked, voicing the question that had been echoing in Alice's mind all evening. It was a question she couldn't answer. Her daughter Jenny lived in a tiny 2-bedroom apartment in Seattle with her husband and 2 teenagers. Her son David was in the middle of a messy divorce in Florida, barely keeping himself afloat. The thought of becoming a burden to her children made her stomach churn. That night, sleep evaded Alice completely. She sat in Tom's old chair, watching the digital clock on her nightstand tick away precious minutes. Each passing hour brought her closer to an uncertain future. She thought about her fellow residents, wondering if they too would face retaliation for speaking up at the meeting. The next morning, Alice forced herself to start packing, even though she had no idea where she'd be taking her belongings. Each item she touched held memories. The blue and white china teacup from her mother. The hand-knitted blanket her sister had made before passing away. Tom's old sweater that still somehow held a trace of his scent. She worked slowly, methodically, the way she used to gray papers back in her teaching days. Box by box, she began dismantling the life she built here. Some residents stopped by throughout the day, their faces a mixture of sadness and fear. Mrs. Chen brought her a sandwich at lunchtime, neither of them mentioning how their hands shook as they shared this simple meal. By afternoon, Alice's room looked half empty, though she barely packed anything. The reality of her situation hit her as she realized she might need to put most of her belongings in storage if she could even afford storage. The thought of losing these tangible connections to her past made her chest tight. She sat down heavily on her bed, allowing herself a moment of weakness. A tear slipped down her cheek, followed by another. In all her years of teaching, through Tom's illness and death, through all life's hardships, Alice had always found a way forward. But now, at 82, she faced the very real possibility of having nowhere to go. The local senior center had a bulletin board with room rentals, but who would rent to an 82-year-old woman on a fixed income? The homeless shelter downtown had a separate wing for seniors, but the thought of ending up there made her whole body tremble. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across her half-packed room, Alice heard excited voices in the hallway. Mrs. O'Brien's daughter was talking animatedly to someone, her voice carrying through the thin walls. "It's absolutely disgusting what they're doing," she was saying. "Someone needs to tell this story. People need to know how they treat their residents." Alice closed her eyes, leaning back in Tom's chair. She thought about all the times in her life when things had seemed hopeless, and how somehow, some way, a path forward had appeared. But this time felt different. This time, she wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for every resident who couldn't speak up, every elderly person who might end up in a similar situation. The evening medication cart rattled past her door, but for the first time in 3 years, it didn't stop at room 237. It seemed her name had already been removed from the medication schedule. Another small indignity, another reminder that her time here was running out. As night fell over Golden Meadows, Alice Wilson sat in her increasingly empty room, surrounded by boxes of memories and uncertain futures, wondering if standing up for what was right had cost her everything she had left. Mrs. O'Brien's daughter Lisa wasn't the type to sit quietly when she saw injustice. As a third-grade teacher herself, she'd inherited her mother's stubborn determination to fight for what was right. The moment she heard about Alice's eviction, she knew she had to do something. "Mom," she said, sitting beside Mrs. O'Brien's bed that evening, "I'm going to call the local news station. This isn't just about Mrs. Wilson anymore, it's about all of you." The next morning, as Alice carefully wrapped her mother's teacups in old newspaper, a gentle knock interrupted her packing. Lisa stood in the doorway, accompanied by a petite woman carrying a professional camera and a tall man holding a microphone. "Mrs. Wilson?" The woman stepped forward with a warm smile. "I'm Ann Richards from Channel 8 News. We'd like to hear your story, if you're willing to share it." Alice smoothed her cardigan, suddenly conscious of the dust on her sleeves from packing. "I'm not sure," she hesitated, looking at the camera. "I don't want to cause more trouble." "You're not causing trouble," Anne said gently. "You're standing up for what's right. Would you tell us what happened?" Something in Anne's kind eyes reminded Alice of her own daughter. Slowly, she nodded, gesturing to Tom's chair. "Would you like to sit down? I can make some tea." Over the next 2 hours, Alice shared everything. She showed them her notebook with its careful documentation of incidents. She explained about the staff shortages, the delayed medications, the desperate calls for help that went unanswered. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke about the monthly meeting and the retaliatory eviction notice. "I taught for 35 years, she told Anne, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I always told my students to speak up when they saw something wrong. How could I do any less?" The camera captured every detail: the half-packed boxes, the family photos carefully wrapped in bubble wrap, the eviction notice sitting on her small table. Other residents began stopping by, sharing their own stories. Mrs. Chen showed the bruises on her wrists. Mr. Peterson described his humiliation. Even Rose, the night nurse, risked her job to speak on camera about the understaffing and impossible workload. "Where will you go?" Anne asked softly, after hearing about Alice's unsuccessful search for a new home. "I don't know," Alice answered honestly. "My savings are gone, and my pension barely covered the fees here. I never thought I'd be homeless at 82. That evening, Alice watched herself on the 6 o'clock news. The story was the lead segment, titled "Elder Abuse or Retaliation. Local Woman Evicted After Speaking Up." The camera had caught every tremor in her hands, every crack in her voice, but also the determination in her eyes when she spoke about standing up for what was right. The response was immediate. By 9 o'clock, the station's phone lines were flooded with calls. Social media exploded with outrage. People shared stories of their own elderly relatives facing similar situations. The local paper picked up the story for their morning edition, featuring a photo of Alice sitting in Tom's chair, surrounded by her half-packed life. Mrs. Thompson appeared in the news segment too, looking polished and professional as she defended the facility's decision. Golden Meadows provides excellent care, she stated firmly. Mrs. Wilson's accusations are unfounded, and her eviction is purely due to her incompatibility with our services. But the cameras had caught something Mrs. Thompson hadn't intended. In the background of her interview, an elderly resident could be seen pressing their call button repeatedly, with no response. By the next morning, Alice's story had gone viral. Local radio stations were discussing it. People were sharing the news segment on every social platform. Comments poured in from across the country. This could be my mother. How dare they treat our elderly this way? Someone needs to help Mrs. Wilson. The parking lot at Golden Meadows filled with news vans from other stations. Reporters gathered at the entrance, hoping to speak with residents or staff. Mrs. Thompson's office phone rang constantly, but she had mysteriously taken a personal day. Alice watched it all unfold with a mixture of hope and anxiety. The attention was overwhelming, but each supportive comment and shared story reminded her why she'd spoken up in the first place. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every elderly person who had ever felt powerless or afraid to speak up. Late that afternoon, as Alice sat watching the sunset through her window, her phone rang. It was Jenny, her daughter, calling from Seattle. "Mom, I saw the news." Jenny's voice cracked. "Why didn't you tell me how bad things were getting? I'm booking a flight right now." "No, sweetheart," Alice said firmly. "You can't leave the kids, and I won't be a burden." "You're not a burden, Mom. You're my mother, and you taught me to stand up for what's right, just like you're doing now." As they talked, Alice's email inbox began filling up. People were reaching out. Former students, old colleagues, complete strangers touched by her story. Some offered spare rooms, others wanted to contribute to a fund to help her find new housing. Local senior advocacy groups were calling, offering legal support. That night, as Alice prepared for bed in her increasingly empty room, she thought about how one small act of courage had sparked something much bigger. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time since receiving the eviction notice, she felt something she had almost lost: hope. Her phone buzzed with a text from Annie. "Mrs. Wilson, someone important wants to talk to you tomorrow. I think you're going to want to hear what they have to say." Alice smiled, thinking of what Tom would say if he could see all this. "You did good, old girl," she could almost hear him whisper. "You did real good." The morning after the news broadcast, Alice woke to the sound of rain pattering against her window. She'd barely slept, her mind racing with thoughts of what would come next. The cardboard boxes scattered around her room seemed to mock her uncertainty about the future. As she sipped her morning tea, a ritual she maintained no matter what chaos swirled around her, her phone buzzed with a message from Anne, the news reporter. "The person I mentioned will be here at 10 a.m. I think you want to hear what he has to say." Alice checked her reflection in the small mirror above her dresser, straightening her collar and pinning her silver hair neatly in place. Her mother had always said, "Face whatever comes with dignity." Even now, with her world turned upside down, Alice held on to that advice. At precisely 10 a.m., Anne arrived with a distinguished-looking gentleman in his early 60s. He wore a well-tailored suit, but his kind eyes and gentle smile immediately put Alice at ease. "Mrs. Wilson," Anne began, "I'd like you to meet Robert Chen. He owns several assisted living facilities in the area, including Sunrise Haven." Alice's heart skipped a beat. Everyone knew about Sunrise Haven. It was the kind of place families dreamed of placing their loved ones, a facility known for its exceptional care and genuine compassion for residents. It was also well out of her price range. "Please call me Bob," he said warmly, taking a seat in the chair Alice offered. "I saw your story last night, Mrs. Wilson, and I couldn't sleep. You see, your situation, it reminded me so much of my own mother." His voice softened as he continued. 10 years ago, my mother was in a facility much like this one. She tried to speak up about poor care, just like you did. But unlike you, she was too afraid to push harder. She suffered in silence, and we lost her 3 months later due to negligent care. Alice noticed his hands trembling slightly as he spoke. This wasn't a businessman making a PR move. This was a son still carrying the weight of his mother's story. After she passed, Bob continued, I promised myself I would do something to change things. I sold my real estate business and invested everything in creating assisted living facilities that truly care for their residents, places where no one would ever feel afraid to speak up. He leaned forward, his expression earnest. Mrs. Wilson, I'd like to offer you a home at Sunrise Haven. Alice's heart sank. That's very kind, but I'm afraid I couldn't possibly afford. Let me finish, Bob said gently. I'm offering you a permanent place at a rate that matches what you're currently paying here. We'll even help with the moving costs. Alice's hands trembled as she set down her teacup. But why? You don't know me. Because what you did matters, Bob replied. Speaking up when others stayed silent, risking everything to stand up for what's right. That's exactly the kind of courage we need more of in this world. And frankly, Mrs. Wilson, I think Sunrise Haven needs someone like you. As Bob explained more about Sunrise Haven, Alice felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. He showed her photos on his tablet. Bright, spacious rooms, beautiful gardens, residents engaged in activities. But what caught her attention most were the smiling faces of the staff, the way they interacted with residents like family. We have strict staff-to-resident ratios, Bob explained. No one waits hours for help. Our nurses have time to actually talk with residents, to know them as people, not just room numbers. We have regular family councils where residents and their families can voice concerns without fear of retaliation. Alice thought of her fellow residents at Golden Meadows. What about the others here? They need help too. Bob smiled. I wondered if you'd ask that. We actually have several openings right now. If any of your friends here are interested, I'd be happy to talk with them too. Tears welled in Alice's eyes as the reality of what was happening sank in. She glanced at Tom's photo on the windowsill, almost able to hear his voice. See? Good things happen to good people, old girl. Just then, a commotion erupted in the hallway. Mrs. Thompson had finally returned to work, only to find news cameras still camped outside and state health inspectors waiting in her office. The sound of her heels clicking rapidly down the corridor was followed by raised voices and more camera flashes. Perhaps we should continue this conversation at Sunrise Haven, Bob suggested kindly. You could tour the facility, meet some of the residents and staff, see if it feels like somewhere you could call home. As they made arrangements for the visit, Alice's phone buzzed again. It was Jenny, her daughter. Mom just landed at the airport. Don't make any decisions until I get there. Alice smiled, typing back. Perfect timing, sweetheart. I think I found my new home, but I'd love for you to see it first. Looking around her half-packed room, Alice realized that what had started as an ending was becoming a new beginning. Her stand for justice hadn't just saved herself, it was opening doors for others too. You know, she said to Bob as they prepared to leave, I taught my students for years that one person speaking up can change things. I just never expected to be proving that lesson at 82. Bob helped her with her coat, treating her with the same respect he'd show his own mother. Mrs. Wilson, I have a feeling you're not done teaching yet. Sunrise Haven and the world needs more voices like yours. As they walked toward the exit, other residents poked their heads out of their rooms, hope dawning in their eyes. Alice had shown them that speaking up could lead to change, that they deserved better, and that sometimes, when you least expect it, angels disguised as ordinary people show up to help make things right. The morning Alice moved into Sunrise Haven dawned bright and clear, as if nature itself was celebrating her fresh start. Her daughter Jenny had spent the past week helping her pack, each box filled with memories carefully wrapped in paper and love. Even her son David had flown in from Florida, taking time away from his own troubles to help his mother begin this new chapter. Mom, this place is amazing, Jenny said as they pulled up to Sunrise Haven's entrance. The building looked more like a comfortable country inn than a care facility, with flowering gardens and welcoming rocking chairs on the wide front porch. Residents were visible through large windows, some reading in sunny corners, others gathered around card tables. The difference from Golden Meadows was striking from the very first moment. As they approached the entrance, a staff member immediately came out to help with their bags. "Mrs. Wilson, we've been so excited to meet you," she said warmly. "I'm Grace, and I'll be one of your regular care assistants." Inside, the air smelled of fresh-baked cookies rather than antiseptic. The walls were painted in warm, cheerful colors, decorated with local artwork. But what struck Alice most was the sound laughter. Actual, genuine laughter echoing down the hallways. Bob Chen himself was waiting in the lobby. "Welcome home, Mrs. Wilson," he said, before turning to greet Jenny and David. "Your mother is going to be a wonderful addition to our community." Alice's new room was twice the size of her old one, with large windows overlooking the garden. Someone had already placed a vase of fresh flowers on the windowsill, but the biggest surprise came when Bob opened a door Alice had assumed was a closet. "This is your sitting room," he explained. "Every resident has one. We believe everyone needs their own space to entertain visitors or just relax." Jenny squeezed her mother's hand as they took in the cozy space, complete with comfortable chairs and a small desk. "Mom, it's perfect," she whispered. As they unpacked, other residents stopped by to welcome Alice. Unlike at Golden Meadows, where everyone seemed withdrawn and afraid, these residents were chatty and engaged. Mrs. Clark from down the hall brought homemade banana bread. Mr. Wilson, no relation, offered to show Alice where the best bird-watching spots were in the garden. "We have daily activities," Grace explained as she helped arrange Alice's clothes in the spacious closet. "Exercise classes, art workshops, book clubs. But nothing's mandatory. It's your home. You choose how to spend your time." Alice noticed how Grace took care to arrange everything exactly as she requested, treating each item with respect. When she reached Tom's old sweater, she didn't just hang it. She asked Alice where she'd like it placed. The morning passed in a blur of unpacking and arranging. By lunchtime, Alice's new space was beginning to feel like home. Bob invited her family to join the residents for lunch in the dining room, where they discovered another pleasant surprise. "The food here is actually good," David remarked, enjoying his grilled salmon. "Like restaurant good." "We have real chefs," Bob explained. "And residents can request their favorite meals or share family recipes with the kitchen. Mrs. Wilson, I hear you're famous for your apple pie." Alice blushed. "Well, I wouldn't say famous." "Our cooking club meets on Thursdays," a resident at the next table chimed in. "We'd love to have you join us." After lunch, Grace showed them the rest of the facility. The library was stocked with books and comfortable reading nooks. The activity room had residents working on various projects, some painting, others doing puzzles or crafts. In the garden, raised beds allowed residents to grow their own flowers and vegetables. But what impressed Alice most was watching the staff interactions. When a resident pressed their call button, someone responded within minutes. The nurses knew everyone by name and stopped to chat as they made their rounds. There was no rushing, no impatience, just genuine care and attention. "We're fully staffed," Grace explained. 3 shifts, plenty of overlap. Nobody has to wait hours for help here. As evening approached, Jenny and David reluctantly prepared to leave. "Aren't you sure you'll be okay, Mom?" Jenny asked, even though they both knew this place was everything they could have hoped for. "I'll be fine, sweetheart," Alice assured her. More than fine. After her children left, Alice sat in her new sitting room, taking it all in. Tom's chair fit perfectly in the corner by the window. Her family photos lined the shelves, and her mother's teacups were safely displayed in a small cabinet. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Bob, checking in before heading home. "How are you settling in?" he asked. "It's all a bit overwhelming," Alice admitted. "In the best possible way. I keep waiting to wake up and find it was all a dream." Bob smiled. "No dream, Mrs. Wilson, but I do have one more surprise for you." He handed her a folder. "Remember how you mentioned your concerns about your friends at Golden Meadows?" Inside the folder were admission papers for Mrs. Chen and Mr. Peterson. "They'll be joining us next week," Bob explained. "Same arrangement as yours. And we're reviewing applications from 3 other residents." Tears welled in Alice's eyes. "I don't know how to thank you." "You already have," Bob replied. "By showing us all that one person's courage can make a difference." He paused at the door. Oh, and the Residents' Council meets on Monday. They're very interested in having your voice on the committee. That night, as Alice prepared for bed in her new room, she felt a peace she hadn't known in years. The night staff had already stopped by to introduce themselves, assuring her they were just a button press away if she needed anything. Looking out her window at the garden below, now lit by soft landscape lighting, Alice thought about how different this night was from just a few weeks ago when she'd sat in her old room wondering if she'd end up homeless. "You'd love this place, Tom," she whispered to his photo on her nightstand. "Maybe everything does happen for a reason." As she drifted off to sleep, Alice realized that sometimes the end of one chapter is just the beginning of a better one. Her stand for justice hadn't just changed her life, it was creating ripples that would help others find their way home too. 6 months after Alice moved to Sunrise Haven, she sat in the state capitol building, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she waited to testify before the healthcare committee. The room was packed with people, other seniors, care facility owners, reporters, and lawmakers all gathered to discuss the proposed Wilson Act. "I never expected to be here," Alice whispered to Bob Chen, who sat supportively beside her. "I was just trying to do what was right." "Sometimes that's all it takes to start something big," he replied with a gentle smile. The Wilson Act had grown out of Alice's story, which had continued to spread long after the initial news coverage faded. Other elderly residents and their families had come forward with similar experiences. What started as one woman's stand for dignity had sparked a movement for reform in elderly care facilities across the state. When Alice's name was called, she made her way to the microphone with careful steps, her back straight despite her nerves. The notebook she'd kept at Golden Meadows sat on the podium in front of her, its pages now dog-eared and familiar. "My name is Alice Wilson," she began, her teacher's voice carrying clearly through the room. "6 months ago, I was almost homeless because I spoke up about poor conditions in my nursing home. Today, I'm here to make sure no other senior citizen faces that fear." As she shared her story, Alice saw heads nodding throughout the room. She told them about the long waits for help, the missed medications, the staff stretched too thin to provide proper care. But she also told them about Sunrise Haven, about what good care looked like, about how every elderly person deserved to live with dignity. "The proposed law isn't just about regulations," she explained. "It's about protecting people who speak up. It's about making sure there are enough staff to provide proper care. It's about treating our elderly citizens like human beings, not room numbers." Back at Sunrise Haven, life had blossomed in ways Alice never expected. Mrs. Chen and Mr. Peterson had indeed joined her, along with 5 other residents from Golden Meadows. The monthly Residents' Council meetings, which Alice now chaired, were lively discussions where everyone's voice was heard and respected. She'd started a writing group where residents shared their life stories. Mr. Peterson, it turned out, had been a war correspondent with fascinating tales to tell. Mrs. Chen was documenting her family's journey from China 3 generations ago. Their stories were being collected into a book that local schools would use to connect students with senior citizens. The cooking club had become so popular that they now prepared monthly community dinners where residents' families joined them. Alice's apple pie had indeed become famous, with the local paper featuring her recipe in their weekend section. But the biggest changes were happening beyond Sunrise Haven's walls. The state investigation into Golden Meadows, sparked by Alice's story, had led to new ownership and complete restructuring of the facility. Mrs. Thompson had been replaced by an administrator who actually cared about resident welfare. Other nursing homes in the area had started implementing changes before they were forced to, improving staff ratios and creating better complaint procedures. Some reached out to Bob for guidance, leading to a network of facilities sharing best practices for elder care. As Alice concluded her testimony, a young senator raised her hand. "Mrs. Wilson, you've become quite an advocate for elderly rights. What drives you to keep fighting?" Alice thought for a moment, her hand touching the locket around her neck that held Tom's picture. "When I was teaching, I always told my students that one person speaking up can change the world. I never thought I'd be proving that lesson at 82. But here's what I've learned. It's never too late to stand up for what's right, and you're never too old to make a difference." The committee voted unanimously to move the Wilson Act forward. As Alice left the Capitol building that afternoon, supported by Bob and surrounded by well-wishers, she saw a group of nursing home residents in wheelchairs holding signs that read, "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson," and "Dignity for All." That evening, back in her comfortable room at Sunrise Haven, Alice looked through the dozens of letters she'd received from people across the country. Some shared their own stories of elder care struggles. Others offered thanks for giving them courage to speak up. Many were from younger people inspired to work toward improving elderly care. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jenny. "Saw you on the news, Mom. You're my hero." Alice smiled, thinking about the strange path that had led her here. From a scared, lonely woman facing eviction to someone making real change in the world. Her gaze fell on Tom's photo, and she could almost hear him saying, "I always knew you had it in you, old girl." A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. It was Grace, bringing her evening tea. "Big day, Mrs. Wilson. The other residents are so proud. They're planning a celebration for when the law passes." "When, not if," Alice asked with a smile. "After your testimony today?" "Definitely when," Grace replied, arranging the tea tray just the way Alice liked it. "You know, my grandmother's nursing home is already making changes because of your story. You're changing lives, Mrs. Wilson." As the sun set over Sunrise Haven's gardens, Alice sipped her tea and reflected on how life's hardest moments sometimes lead to unexpected blessings. Her stand for justice hadn't just found her a better home, it had created a movement that would help countless others find dignity in their golden years. Sometimes, she thought, watching the birds settle in for the night, the best chapters of our story come when we least expect them. And sometimes, they're the chapters that help write a better story for everyone else too.